Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving, ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again come.
Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving, cause is your caravan hour is standing, cause is no caravan hour is living, cause is no caravan hour is standing, cause is no caravan
Welcome to this virtual service of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the Emerald Coast. We welcome all to our community, whether physical or virtual, with open arms and open minds. Our members and friends come from all religious backgrounds and have a wide variety of spiritual beliefs, but we share our UU principles and our work to promote justice and a beloved community here and now for all, without regard to race, sexual preference, political views, age, or any other artificial barrier that might serve to separate us rather than join us. We value exploration and find hope and wisdom from many sources. We're glad you have found us and hope you'll enjoy today's service. Our speaker this morning is the Reverend Meg Barnhouse, currently serving as minister at the First Unitarian Church of Austin, Texas. She's also a witty writer, having published a number of books, and a songwriter. Reverend Barnhouse has graciously allowed us to share several of her messages with you in the coming weeks. And now, the chalice lighting.
Across the distance, the light from within me shines, sending love to all. Across the distance, your light is fuel that warms me and helps to keep my own light burning. Together, we keep the flame of community burning bright.
Hi, this is Amy again, and today I have a story for you that's a folk story. It's sort of out there in a lot of different versions. The Jewish version we always tell every year at Passover when we're sharing a big meal, but there's also a Christian version and a Hindu version and a Buddhist version, and this happens to be the Hindu version. But sometimes it's called the story of the long spoons, or the difference between heaven and hell. But it's basically a story about how we really need to take care of each other. And when we take care of each other, there's heaven right here on earth. So this is the story of the long spoons, and we'll get to the pictures, or at least one picture. So one time, long time ago in India, there was a man named Amul, and he'd been walking along, and it was very hot, and he sat down under a tree in the shade to rest, and it was lunchtime, and he was hungry, and he thought he'd like to have a cold mango lassi, and the lassi is a yogurt drink, which is really, really good. and it's sweet and it's cool. And instantly it appeared in his hand, and he drank it, and that was wonderful. And then he thought, wow, I'd really like to have some nice lentil stew and perhaps some rice to mix with it. And there it was right in his hand. And he thought, what's this? Everything I want, it just comes to me. This must be a very special tree. So he decided just to stay right there and not ever move. But finally, I really ought to go home. But if he stayed under the tree, he'd never have to work for food again. It would just show up. Well, he didn't know what to do. And then appeared before him a holy man, a sage, and who asked him, what's the problem? And he said, well, I might already be in heaven, but I don't know. Is this heaven? Can you show me? And the holy man said, there's always a catch with holy men. I can show you, but the road to heaven leads through hell. So we have to go there first. So he says, well, okay, that's fine. We'll do it. Please take me there. So the holy man led Amul down the road, and they both vanished, and they landed in hell right at noontime. And let's see, so it was noontime. It was time for lunch. And there was this big table spread out with all this beautiful food. And he thought, oh my gosh, this is hell, And then the dinner bell rang, and it went bang, bang, bang. It's time to eat. And everybody just stood there. And Amul noticed that, see this little spoon here tied to this man's arm? Long spoon. He couldn't bend his elbow. He had to have his arm straight. So the people could scoop up food with their spoons, but they couldn't get it into their mouth. So there was all this food, but they couldn't eat anything, and they were hungry, and all of a sudden the bell rang again, went bang, bang, bang. And he said, lunch is over. But everybody was so still, so hungry. And they were getting really thin, skin and bones. So Amul and the wise man, they flew off to heaven, where, you know what? It looked exactly the same. All this food, all these people. And the bell went bang, bang, bang. It's time to eat. And everybody scooped up some food with their long spoon on their arm. But instead of trying to get it in their own mouth, they gave it to somebody else. And everybody fed everybody else. And all the food was gone, and everybody was happy, and everybody was full, and they were smiling. And the sage looked at Amul, and Amul said, I understand. And the holy man told him, you see, heaven and hell are right here on earth all the time. It's very simple. What you receive, you must also give. If you only think of your own happiness, you will never, ever be happy. So I think Amul then went back to sitting under his tree and asked for a lot of food, and then shared it with all of his family and his neighborhood and his city and anybody else he could share it with. So that's the story of the long spoons. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll have more stories another time. Bye.
If I think of my life as a class and what I've really learned, I've learned a few things. First, I'm aware that I'm a child of God. It's such an amazing understanding to think that the it, which made fleas and mountains and rivers and stars, made me. What I prayed for is humility, to know that there is something greater than I. Then I have to know that the brute, the bigot, and the batterer are all children of God, whether they know it or not. And I'm supposed to treat them accordingly. And it's hard, and I blow it all the time.
Mongrel class of people.
I'd like everybody to think of a statement by Terence. The statement is, I am a human being. Nothing human can be alien to me. If you can internalize the least portion of that, you will never be able to say of an act, a criminal act, or I couldn't do that. No matter how heinous the crime, if a human being did it, you have to say, I have in me all the components that are in her or in him. I intend to use my energies constructively as opposed to destructively. If you can do that about the negative, just think what you can do about the positive. If a human being dreams a great dream, dares to love somebody, if a human being dares to be Martin King or Mahatma Gandhi or Mother Teresa or Malcolm X, if a human being dares to be bigger than the condition into which she or he was born, it means so can you. And so you can try to stretch yourself. So you can internalize, homo sum, humani nihila me alienum puto. I am a human being. Nothing human can be alien to me. That's one thing I'm learning.
When ministers get together to talk about their churches, one of the questions is, what's in the DNA of your congregation? How are they with religious education? How are they with money? How are they in terms of relating to their ministers? What's their pattern? Do they have one? This sermon is not about that, but that kind of question has gotten me to thinking about what is in the DNA of policing. Because there can be things that are deep, deep, deep in the past of a congregation that affect the congregation's present without anyone even knowing consciously what it is that is affecting them. And so I'm wondering if there are things deep, deep, deep in the roots of policing that are affecting policing now. And I've been reading all this week, and the results are, in the words of Mary Daly, amazing, which means you're in a maze, you can't find your way to think clearly about it, and then you read or think or learn something that takes you out of the maze, and you've just now been amazed. As I've been learning, I have been having a more compassionate perspective on people who are trying to be professional law enforcement folks as they deal with the demons in their DNA. And more horrified perspective as I see uncovered, really plain to see, the demons in the DNA of policing. In the early colonies in the 1600s, policing took three forms. One was the watch, the night watch. And these were people who were volunteers or conscripted or put on the night watch as a little punishment for some little crime that they did. And mostly people just slept through their watch, or they were drunk through their watch and therefore ineffectual. Another group was called the Stick, and they were paid for-profit people who worked mostly for the rich, keeping them safe and keeping their property safe. The third is the constables, and the constables were paid through the fees for warrants they would serve. They were also supposed to do land surveying and making sure merchants were using fair weights and measures. Sometimes they had the job of supervising those miscreants on the watch. It was not until the 1830s that a centralized police department first emerged in Boston, and then in New York and all the major cities afterwards. By the 1880s, all major U.S. cities had municipal police departments that were, 1, taxpayer-supported and bureaucratic, 2, they were full-time employees, 3, the departments had rules and procedures, and 4, they were all accountable to a central authority. So cities were growing, and it's not easy to control drunkenness and prostitution when you're not in a little village. And immigrants were pouring in to our nation from Ireland and from Italy, and they brought their own ideas of how to make it with them, and sometimes that was a bit criminal. If you want to watch the movie Gangs of New York, you'll see a very interesting and wild picture of what New York City was like when there were just gangs of Irish people and gangs of Italian people roaming the streets and all tied to a certain political boss. Now, in this time, it became the way things are, that the political bosses controlled the police, who all together controlled crime. And by controlled crime, I don't mean make it not happen. I mean they were the ones who were organizing the crime in the cities. Police work was framed as keeping good order. You can let the organized crime keep going on, but you don't want anybody messing up the system. So police were supposed to keep good order. Now, who defines good order? The people with the money and the power define good order, right? Now let's go south for a moment. In the South, it was a whole different story. The roots of policing in the South are in the slave patrols. Young white men between 21 and 45 were conscripted to the slave patrols. Everyone had to do it for a year unless you paid your way out of it. So landowners, owners of enslaved humans, regular farmers who did not own anybody, tradespeople, and pretty much the rest of everybody. If you were white and if you were male, you had to work in the slave patrols. What did they do? Well, they patrolled and made sure that all the enslaved people who were walking around had their proper papers and were in their proper place and didn't have any torches, because enslaved folks setting things on fire was the big fear. Has that affected our lives today? Oh, yes. If you were caught with a torch, you could have up to 30 lashes given to you, not after court procedure, but right there in the street. The slave patrols were deputized to police and control the enslaved black people, and to police and control the free black people who had to show their papers all the time to prove that they were not enslaved people. And they were empowered to give out punishment to a man, a woman, or a child on the street right there. That's what the slave patrols did. Now, I listened to a very interesting program on NPR called Throughline, and a man named Khalil Gibran Muhammad said this. He put it like this. They were talking about policing. He said, so the tying together early on, the surveillance, the deputization essentially of all white men to be police officers, or in this case, slave patrollers, and then to dispense corporal punishment on the scene are all baked in from the very beginning. Baked in is another way of saying in the DNA, which is another way of saying it's systemic. In the South, these informal vigilante groups evolved into the KKK, who were policing and terrorizing black folks long after slavery ended into the 1920s. One magistrate wrote to Washington in the 20s and said, there is just Klan court here, that's all we have. Our system of justice is pretty fragile, and we have Klan justice and Klan court. And it got so bad and so violent, and the Klan got so out of control that in the 1920s, the federal government had to step in. Let's go back north again. By the beginning of the 20th century, the political bosses ran the organized crime with the help of the police, and the corruption was nearly total. Then the labor movement began, and the police were suddenly used to control the labor riots, which the workers they would call them strikes. So what one person calls a protest, another person calls a riot. What one person calls a strike, another person calls a riot, ensuring a docile and continuous supply of cheap labor who behaved in an orderly way and would keep the factories and mills running to keep the country supplied with goods. That was seen as keeping good order. And the power and moneyed interests had a greater investment in social control than in crime control. And these moneyed interests were the ones who paid the taxes that paid the police. They were all together in a Gordian knot. And so, according to Dr. Gary Potter, who teaches justice studies at Eastern Kentucky University, the way that social control and crime control got to be the same thing is, he says, defining social control as crime control was accomplished by raising the specter of the dangerous classes. You know who was in the dangerous classes. You could tick the populations off on one hand. The suggestion was that public drunkenness, crime, hooliganism, political protests, and worker riots were the product of a biologically inferior, morally intemperate, unskilled, and uneducated underclass. At this time, patrol wagons were created so that larger numbers of people could be arrested at the same time. Alarm boxes were set up in the cities, and respectable white business folk, men, were given the keys to these alarm boxes so they could open the box and alert the police if they felt their property or person was not safe. Over the years, commissions were formed, the first one in 1840, but they were formed over and over again, and they would uncover tremendous corruption of politicians and police. And everybody would say, oh no, and then the report would be shelved and things would go on. Now, until Prohibition happened, and suddenly the police and the politicians lost their grip on organized crime because every young white Irish immigrant, Italian immigrant, I'm sure some black folks too, although that's not in the history book I read, big surprise, were involved in bootlegging. Now, bootlegging was a crime, and the police chased everybody for it, and the police couldn't be the ones who controlled bootlegging, and other big organized crime bosses emerged. In the 1950s, there was a push to professionalize police departments. A great big push, big textbooks were written on how to do this, and what they recommended was tightening up of the bureaucracy, more rules, more authority, and bigger police officers in military-like roles who would then control the rank-and-file police officers so as not to have so many complaints of police corruption and brutality, to try to make things better. But in order to make things better, they made things tighter and more authoritarian, and the rank and file didn't like that. So by the 60s, police unions were formed to resist the enforcement of the rules made by the upper ups. And so the heavy hand of justice fell because, you know, there is real crime. There was real crime, and they needed real policing. But somehow the heavy hand of the police department fell most heavily, sometimes almost exclusively heavily, on the Black, brown, and Native folks. So when you're talking about the DNA of policing, when you're talking about what's baked in or what's in the system or what's systemic to policing, you're talking about a whole institution of law enforcement that contains many good-hearted people who want to do the right thing, but whose roots are sunk deep into this poisoned ground of trying to protect the economic interests of the wealthy and trying to keep the dangerous classes away from the wealthy, and trying to dominate and control any social disorder, unrest, protest. Because when people are out in the streets protesting, there's fear of lack of control. And what many people want to do when they're in that situation is increase the violence of their control. As our president says, dominate. Don't be too gentle with them. And so we're in a period in our society where we're trying to reimagine what policing might look like. What might actual public safety look like? Defund the police is a slogan you're going to hear, and it is brilliant, I have to say, because it terrifies people. And I took a course once on engaging people in conversations, and they said if you want people to be really engaged in a conversation, you start the conversation with what they call an interest-creating remark. Well, my lovelies, defund the police is about as interest-creating a remark as you could have, because people, you know, if you're holding a sign that says reform the police, people are like, yeah, we've done that before. Defund, though, that makes people just nuts, and they want to engage in the conversation. And since my theme this year is curiosity, how would we engage that very brilliant but inflammatory slogan? How would we engage that with curiosity? What would that look like? If somebody breaks into our house and we call 911, is nobody going to come? No, that's not what they mean. But I'm not going to go into what they mean because this sermon is long enough already. Let's do our own research. So what I found out in my research this week is that this system, for the good of our culture, for the good of good-hearted police and those who want to truly be about public safety, this system has to be uprooted from the corruption, racism, toadying, and violence of the ground it grew in. I don't know what that means. We need law enforcement, of course. We need public safety. We need to redefine dangerous classes. We need not to try to make the police do everything: social work, mental health, resolving arguments, being a mediator in a neighborhood. They don't need to take on all that stuff. They're not trained to take on all that stuff. And you may argue with me, but to me, a dangerous class is a class of people who have done damage, a class of people who have done massive, widespread damage to a whole culture And it seems to me that the Billionaires Club that's been running our country for 200 years are the most damn dangerous people that I can think of. So what do we do about that? We need good people working for the public good of everyone. May it be so.
The flame is extinguished, but not our hope for the future, our courage in the face of crisis, or the love we share in our world.
When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy